Modern life gives people endless ways to express themselves. Profiles, aesthetics, trends, opinions, personal brands. But somewhere along the way, many people stopped asking a much deeper question. Who am I without all of this? Because the modern world constantly tells people who they should become, what to buy, what to believe, what success should look like, and after enough exposure, people slowly stop hearing their own voice underneath all the noise. Identity becomes something people perform instead of something they discover. People learn how to appear interesting before they ever learn who they actually are. So they build personalities out of trends, out of algorithms, out of external validation, and eventually, the performance becomes so constant that many people no longer know where the mask ends and the real person begins. Maybe that's why so many people feel internally disconnected now, because modern life gives people endless ways to present themselves to the world while giving them very little time to understand themselves in private. Human beings have always been influenced by the world around them, but never at this scale. Modern algorithms shape attention constantly, what people desire, what they fear, what they admire. Even personality itself is becoming increasingly externalized. People consume identities now, entire lifestyles, entire belief systems, entire personalities, and eventually, many people start becoming reflections of whatever they consume most. The internet creates the illusion of individuality, while quietly making everyone think more similarly. People begin copying ways of speaking, ways of dressing, ways of thinking, even ways of feeling, and most of it happens unconsciously. That's what makes modern influence so powerful. It rarely feels like influence, it feels like choice. But the moment millions of people are consuming the same content every day, the same aesthetics, the same opinions, the same emotional reactions, individuality slowly begins to blur. And over time, people stop asking themselves what they genuinely believe, what they genuinely enjoy, what genuinely feels authentic to them. Instead, they absorb identities already packaged for consumption. Ready-made personalities, ready-made worldviews, ready-made versions of success. And social media accelerates this process endlessly. Because people are no longer only comparing achievements, they are comparing entire identities. Who looks happier? Who looks smarter? Who looks more attractive? Who seems more successful? Who appears more fulfilled? So people slowly adapt themselves to fit what receives validation, not necessarily what feels true. And eventually, many people begin living performative versions of themselves for so long that they lose connection with who they were before the performance started. That's why modern identity feels so unstable now. People are constantly reshaping themselves based on external feedback, likes, trends, attention, approval, algorithms. And when identity becomes dependent on external validation, the self becomes fragile. Because it is no longer built internally, it is built through reaction, through comparison, through audience perception. And maybe that's why so many people secretly feel lost now, despite expressing themselves more than ever before. Because expression without self-understanding can still create emptiness, especially when the version being expressed was never fully authentic to begin with. The problem is not influence itself. The problem is constant exposure without reflection. Because when people never spend time alone with their own thoughts, they slowly lose connection with themselves, their real preferences, their real values, their real emotions. Everything becomes reactive, performative, conditioned. And over time, many people build identities entirely around external validation. Attention becomes identity. Approval becomes self-worth. Consumption becomes personality. People begin shaping themselves around what gets rewarded externally, instead of what feels authentic internally. So they adapt constantly, different personalities for different audiences, different versions of themselves depending on what receives acceptance. And eventually, they become so focused on being perceived a certain way that they stop asking whether any of it actually feels real. That's the strange thing about modern identity. People can express themselves constantly, while still feeling completely disconnected internally. Because expression is not the same thing as self-understanding, and without reflection, people rarely notice how much of themselves was built through imitation, opinions absorbed from the internet, desires created through comparison, goals inherited from culture, even insecurities manufactured through constant exposure. At some point, many people are no longer choosing who they are becoming consciously. They are simply reacting to whatever environment surrounds them most. And the mind adapts quickly to external feedback. Validation feels rewarding, attention feels meaningful, approval feels like belonging. So people slowly begin outsourcing their identity to the reactions of others. And when self-worth becomes dependent on external response, people lose stability internally, because the self keeps changing based on what gets accepted, what gets praised, what gets attention. That's why so many people feel uncertain about who they really are once the distractions disappear. Because underneath all the performance, there is often very little time spent alone discovering the person beneath it, the real personality, the real values, the real self untouched by constant influence. And maybe that's why modern life creates so much internal confusion. People spend years learning how to present themselves without ever learning how to truly know themselves. Self-awareness requires silence, reflection, stillness. But modern life leaves very little room for those things. The moment discomfort appears, people immediately escape into stimulation. Music, content, scrolling, noise, anything to avoid being alone with the mind for too long. But without introspection, people never fully discover themselves. They only discover versions of themselves shaped by constant influence. Because understanding yourself takes time, it takes honesty, and most importantly, it takes moments where external noise finally becomes quiet enough to hear your own thoughts clearly. But modern life trains people to avoid those moments. Silence now feels uncomfortable to many people, almost threatening, because silence removes distraction. And without distraction, people are forced to confront what exists underneath the performance: their uncertainty, their insecurity, their loneliness, the parts of themselves they've been avoiding for years. So instead, they stay constantly occupied, always consuming, always distracted, always connected to something externally, because stimulation creates temporary escape from internal discomfort. But the longer people avoid introspection, the harder it becomes to separate who they truly are from who they were conditioned to become. That's why many people feel strangely disconnected from their own lives now. Not because they lack freedom, but because they rarely slow down long enough to examine themselves honestly, to question their desires, their habits, their beliefs, to ask, do I actually want this life? Or did I simply inherit this version of success from the world around me? And honestly, that question has become increasingly difficult to answer in modern life, because people are constantly absorbing influence without realizing it. Every platform competing for attention, every algorithm shaping perception, every trend quietly teaching people what is considered desirable. And eventually, many people stop building identities internally. They build them through reaction, through comparison, through performance. But self-awareness cannot exist entirely through external feedback. It requires solitude. It requires observation. It requires learning how to sit alone long enough to notice who you are underneath all the influence. And maybe that's why introspection became so rare now. Because in a world designed to constantly stimulate the mind, stillness almost feels rebellious. At some point, I realized modern life is incredibly good at keeping people distracted from themselves, constantly entertained, constantly stimulated, constantly consuming, but rarely reflecting. And maybe that's why so many people feel internally disconnected now, because self-understanding cannot exist inside constant noise. You cannot hear your own thoughts clearly when the world is speaking to you every second. And the strange part is, most people don't even notice it happening, because distraction feels normal now. Constant stimulation feels normal. Being mentally occupied every second feels normal. So people move through life constantly absorbing information without ever stopping to ask what all that information is doing to their identity. Who would they be without constant influence? without algorithms shaping attention, without external validation guiding decisions, without comparison controlling self-worth. Most people never fully find out, because the moment silence appears, something immediately fills it. Another video, another opinion, another distraction. And over time, the mind becomes crowded with so many external voices that people stop recognizing their own. That's why so many people secretly feel lost now, not because they lack access to information, but because they lack connection to themselves. They know what the internet thinks, what culture rewards, what society admires, but they no longer know what genuinely feels true to them internally. And maybe that's the real cost of constant distraction, not just shortened attention spans, but weakened self-awareness. Because the more noise surrounding a person, the harder it becomes to hear their own intuition clearly, their own desires, their own direction. At some point, I started realizing that clarity only appeared when the noise finally stopped. Not during stimulation, not during endless consumption, but afterward, in silence, in solitude, in moments where the mind finally had space to observe itself again. That's where real identity begins to appear, not the curated version, not the performative version, the real one underneath all the influence. And maybe that's why so many people are exhausted now, because trying to maintain externally constructed identities all the time is mentally exhausting. Eventually, the mind wants rest from performance, rest from comparison, rest from constant influence. And maybe real self-understanding begins the moment a person becomes quiet enough to finally hear themselves again. So I started spending more time away from constant input. Less noise, less distraction, less performance, more reflection, more silence, more intentional thinking. And slowly, something became clear. Most people are not disconnected because they are broken. They are disconnected because modern life rarely gives them enough space to truly know themselves. Maybe identity is not something people need to invent. Maybe it appears naturally, once the noise becomes quiet enough. The modern world constantly encourages people to become more visible, more expressive, more performative. But maybe real self-awareness begins somewhere much quieter, in silence, in reflection, in spending enough time alone to separate your own voice from everything the world has been telling you to become. Because honestly, maybe the reason so many people feel lost today is not because they lack information, but because they never had enough silence to truly understand themselves.